The photo loaded slowly, the way photos do on a bad connection, top to bottom, a curtain lifting 1 inch at a time. I was standing at the kitchen island with a dish towel over my shoulder, half listening to the 11 o'clock news mumbling from the other room, when my phone buzzed with the soft chime our shared iCloud album always made. New photo added. I almost didn't look. I looked. A hotel balcony, string lights, a glass of white wine sweating on a railing, and my husband's hand flat against the small of my sister's back, his thumb hooked just under the waistband of her skirt, in a way you do not touch a sister-in-law, in a way you do not touch anyone you are not sleeping with. Timestamp, 9:42 p.m. 2 nights ago. Location tag, The Wentworth, Charleston, South Carolina. David had told me Charleston was a site visit for a client's beach house. He had told me Claire was in Charleston for a work conference. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. My hands didn't shake either, which surprised me most of all. I turned the phone face down on the granite, finished drying the pan I was holding, and hung the towel back on its hook, straight, the way I always do. Good day, listeners. It's Elena Marsh here. Before I continue, like and subscribe and leave your comment. My name is Elena Marsh. I'm 43 years old. I am a forensic accountant, which is a fancy way of saying I spend my life reading the things people don't want read. The transaction that's 1 digit off. The invoice that's dated a Sunday when the office is closed. The expense report that's suspiciously round. Numbers rarely lied. People did. That had been true of every case that crossed my desk for 19 years, and it turned out to be just as true inside my own kitchen. I met David Marsh when I was 26, at a fundraiser for a children's hospital wing that my firm's partners had bought a table for. He was easy to like, a general contractor with calloused hands and an unhurried laugh, the kind of man who remembered the names of everyone's kids and could fix a leaking faucet without being asked twice. We got married 3 years later in a backyard in Asheville, North Carolina, under a dogwood tree that's still there, bigger now, the one I can see from my kitchen window when I stand at the sink. We tried for children for 6 long years before we stopped trying, and I will not pretend that didn't change us. It hollowed something out and then, strangely, it filled something back in. We built his contracting company together instead, Marsh & Co., me doing the books on nights and weekends until it was steady enough to hire a real bookkeeper, him running crews across 3 counties. 16 years of marriage, 16 years of thinking that shared grief was a kind of glue, that a man who cried with you over an empty nursery couldn't also be capable of small, ordinary betrayal. The infertility years were the ones that shaped us most, and I think that's true for a lot of couples, for better or worse. We did 3 rounds of IUI and 2 of IVF between the time I was 30 and 34, and I remember every needle, every 6 a.m. blood draw at the clinic on Merriman Avenue, every negative test lined up in the bathroom trash like small white failures. David drove me to every single appointment without being asked. He held my hand in waiting rooms full of other couples doing the same silent arithmetic we were doing. When the doctor finally sat us down and used the phrase diminished return on further intervention, David didn't flinch, didn't suggest we try again with someone else's eggs or a surrogate the way some men do when it stops being about the marriage and starts being about the outcome. He just said, okay, then it's us, just us, and that's enough. And for years I believed him completely. Because a man who says that in a fertility clinic parking lot with his forehead against the steering wheel does not seem like a man capable of a storage unit under a fake pretense 4 years later. That's the thing, nobody warns you about grief shared well. It doesn't inoculate you against betrayal. If anything, it makes you a better mark, because you've already decided the worst thing that could happen to your marriage already happened and survived it. We poured what would have gone into a nursery into Marsh & Co. instead. I did the books at our kitchen table on Sunday nights for the first 6 years, unpaid learning contractor accounting the hard way, retention percentages, mechanics liens, the maddening cash flow lag between a job's completion and a client's final check. I was the reason the company survived its first real recession, in year 4, when 3 other contracting outfits in our county folded. I say that not out of vanity, but because it matters later. I was not a passive spouse riding David's success. I built half of it with my own hands at my own kitchen table on my own unpaid time, and that fact would become one of the most important lines in Patricia's opening brief. My younger sister, Claire, was 39, unmarried, and had been the maid of honor at my wedding. She and David had always gotten along. Too well, I would tell myself later, except that too well is the kind of thing you only notice in hindsight when you're combing back through 16 years with a flashlight. Claire worked in medical device sales and traveled constantly, which was, I would come to understand, extremely convenient. She'd been the one who helped me pick my wedding dress, who sat with me in the clinic waiting rooms some of the times David couldn't get away from a job site, who I called first, always, when anything good or bad happened in my life. I trusted her the specific, unguarded way you only trust someone who watched you grow up. That trust is, I think, the actual thing that was stolen from me. Not fidelity in the abstract, but the particular, irreplaceable safety of believing there was one person in my family who would never, under any circumstance, let a man hurt me on purpose. I did not confront David that night. I want to be honest about why. Not because I was afraid, and not because I needed more proof to believe what my own eyes had shown me. I didn't confront him because I have spent 19 years learning that the person who accuses first, before they understand the full shape of the thing, is the person who loses control of the story. I was not going to lose control of my own story, so I became, for the next 11 weeks, exactly what my job had trained me to be. I started with the joint checking account, the one we'd opened the year we got married, and never bothered to close even after we split most of our finances for the business. I hadn't looked at it in probably 2 years. There, buried in a stack of routine automatic payments, the lawn service, the storage unit we kept for his father's old tools, was a supplementary credit card, issued 4 years earlier that I did not remember authorizing. The card was in David's name. The billing statements had been redirected at some point to a P.O. box in a neighboring town, Box 214, a detail I found only because I called the bank's fraud line at 6:50 in the morning, before David woke, and asked a board representative named Kevin to read me the mailing preference history on the account. Kevin had no idea he was handing me the first thread of a rope. I pulled 18 months of statements on that supplementary card, a recurring charge of $340 a month to a self-storage facility across town, not the one with his father's tools, a different one, Unit 118. 4 hotel stays I hadn't known about, totaling $2,890 at properties in Charleston, Wilmington, and once, unbelievably, 40 minutes from our own house. At a Hampton Inn off I-40 on a Tuesday when David had told me he was doing inventory at the warehouse until 9. A charge for $612 at a jewelry store in Wilmington that I had never received a gift from. I sat at my desk at work. I told my assistant I was reconciling a difficult audit, which was, in its own bent way, true, and I built a spreadsheet. I'm good at spreadsheets. Column A, date. Column B, amount. Column C, David's stated location that day, pulled from texts, from our shared calendar, from things he'd told me across the dinner table. Column D, what the statement actually showed. By the 3rd week, the pattern didn't need commentary, it had its own gravity. I drove past the storage facility on a Saturday when David was at a Little League game he coached. I told the front desk clerk I'd lost the entry code to my own unit and needed to confirm the account holder before they'd help me. A small, useful lie, the first of several. She pulled it up. Unit 118, opened 4 years and 2 months ago. Primary account holder, David Marsh. Secondary authorized user, Claire Whitfield. My maiden name, my sister's maiden name, listed together on a storage unit, like a couple furnishing an apartment they didn't want anyone to know about. I sat in my car in that parking lot for 11 minutes without turning the key. Then I drove home and made dinner. Chicken thighs roasting with rosemary, the smell that has meant home to me since before David, since my mother's kitchen, and I let that smell hold the walls up around me while I set the table for 2. The gathering phase, as I came to think of it privately, is where the real work happened, and it is not glamorous. It is spreadsheets and receipts and small humiliating errands run under invented pretexts. I requested our full location history from the family sharing settings on our phones. David had set that up himself. Years ago, a well-meaning safety feature after his father had a fall, so we could always find each other. He had never thought to turn it off for himself, which told me something about how safe he'd always felt, how certain he was that I wasn't the kind of woman who checked. His phone had been at Claire's apartment complex, a gated building 40 minutes north, on 11 separate overnight occasions in the last year alone, always logged as site visit or supplier meeting on our shared family calendar. An app I had also set up, ironically, for the sake of togetherness. I found the passcode to our old joint cloud photo account was still our wedding date, 0614, because David reused passwords the way other men reuse excuses, and there, in an album neither of us had opened in 3 years, were photographs he had forgotten still synced automatically. Claire laughing in a car with the seat reclined, a hotel key card photographed as a joke, a screenshot of a text that read, "I can't keep doing the sneaking around, D, I love you, but I can't." His reply wasn't saved, but I didn't need it. The date on her message was 14 months old. 14 months, and he had kept doing it anyway, and she had kept letting him. I met with a family law attorney named Patricia Ostrander in a small office above a coffee shop downtown. On a Thursday, I told David was a continuing education seminar for my CPA license. Patricia was maybe 60, silver-haired, with the flat, unhurried patience of someone who had heard every version of this story and was no longer surprised by any of them. She told me gently that North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, that marital misconduct doesn't automatically inflate a settlement the way people assume from television, but that documented dissipation of marital assets, money spent on an affair, on hotels, on jewelry, on a secret storage unit, absolutely could and should be clawed back in the final accounting. "Keep collecting?" she told me, quietly. "Don't tip your hand. And Elena, start protecting what's yours before you say a single word to him." I opened a private checking account at a bank across town that David had no relationship with. I moved 6 months of my own salary into it, money that was unambiguously mine, earned before and during the marriage, the kind of thing a good lawyer tells you to document down to the pay stub. I changed the passcode on my personal laptop. I photographed, page by page, our joint tax returns going back 5 years, because Patricia said returns have a way of growing legs during a contentious split. There was one Tuesday evening I nearly got caught. David came home early. A job had rained out, while I had 18 months of bank statements spread across the dining table in neat, color-coded stacks, along with a legal pad of dates in my own handwriting. I heard his truck in the driveway with maybe 40 seconds of warning. I swept everything into a manila folder and shoved it under a stack of unopened mail, and when he walked in and asked what I was working on, I said, without missing a beat, "Insurance audit for the Hendricks file. They're disputing a business interruption claim. It's a nightmare." He nodded, uninterested, the way he always was uninterested in the granular texture of my work, and got himself a beer from the fridge. And I felt something in my chest that was not fear and not guilt, but a kind of cold, clean satisfaction. I had lied to a liar and won. Week 6, I hired a private investigator, a retired sheriff's deputy named Roy Betts, who worked out of a strip mall office next to a nail salon and answered his own phone on the second ring. Patricia had recommended him. "He's slow, but he's never wrong," she'd said, and I paid him in cash from the private account, so there'd be no line item David could ever stumble across. Roy didn't need long. He sat across from me at his particle board desk with a manila folder of his own, thinner than mine but harder in a different way, because his had photographs. He'd followed David for 4 days, discreetly, from a rented gray sedan that Roy said was the most forgettable car God ever let a man build. He had time-stamped photographs of David's truck parked outside Claire's building on a Wednesday night, gone by 6 the next morning. He had a photograph of the two of them at a restaurant 40 minutes outside town, a place David had never once taken me in 16 years, sitting close, David's hand resting on the table over hers. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Roy said, sliding the folder across in the flat, professional voice of a man who has said those words to 100 women before me. "I wish I had better news." I told him he didn't need to apologize, that I hadn't hired him hoping to be wrong. I paid him the balance of his fee, shook his hand, and drove to the grocery store afterward and bought groceries for a dinner I would cook that night for a man I already knew I was going to leave, because routine, I had discovered, was its own kind of armor. There was a second near miss in week 8, worse than the first, because it involved Claire directly. She called me on a Thursday afternoon, breezy, asking if I wanted to get manicures that weekend like old times, and something in her voice, a note pitched slightly too high, slightly too eager, told me she was fishing, trying to gauge whether I suspected anything. I said yes, of course. Saturday at 11. And I spent the entire appointment 2 chairs down from my own sister, both of us with our hands soaking in identical bowls of warm, soapy water, making small talk about our mother's garden and a cousin's upcoming wedding, while my mind ran a silent, parallel ledger. 14 months, minimum $2,890, unit 118, both your names on it. I let her pick the color for my toes. I thanked her when she paid for both of us, an act of unearned generosity I understood. Even then, was probably guilt wearing the shape of kindness. I did not flinch. 19 years of reading other people's fraud had, if nothing else, made me extraordinarily good at not blinking first. In week 7, I called a locksmith, a heavyset, friendly man named Otis who ran a small shop off Merriman Avenue, and told him I wanted the house rekeyed while David was out of town on a supplier trip. A trip I now knew from the family sharing app actually placed his phone at Claire's apartment complex for 2 consecutive nights. Otis didn't ask questions. Men in his line of work rarely do, and I suspect he'd rekeyed enough houses under enough circumstances to recognize the particular calm of a woman who has already decided something and is simply executing the paperwork of it. I told David when he got home that I'd lost my key ring at the grocery store and panicked and had the locks changed as a precaution, and handed him 2 new keys off the ring. Warm from my pocket, and he thanked me for being so on top of it. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway while he tested the new key in the lock, turning it back and forth, satisfied, and thinking, "You have no idea how on top of it I actually am." That same week, I also called our insurance agent, a woman named Priya I'd known professionally for years through overlapping clients, and asked her, under the guise of just doing an annual review, to confirm what riders existed on our homeowner's policy and whether any recent claims had been filed. There was one I didn't recognize. A small claim, $1,150, filed 8 months earlier for water damage to a guest room mattress, a room we didn't have, in a house that had never once flooded. I wrote it into the spreadsheet under its own row, unlabeled, because I hadn't yet worked out what it meant, only that it meant something. It would turn out, months later, during discovery, to correspond almost exactly to the purchase of the mattress Roy had photographed inside the storage unit. David had filed a fraudulent claim against our own homeowner's policy to pay for furniture in the place where he was sleeping with my sister, which is the kind of detail that would be almost funny if it weren't also a felony he never got charged for. Because Patricia and I ultimately decided, together, that the civil case was enough, that criminal referrals would only slow down my own resolution for a satisfaction that wasn't worth the delay. I also, in that same stretch of weeks, went quietly through every drawer and shoebox in the house on afternoons when David was on job sites, the way I imagine other women my age have gone through drawers before me, looking for the physical debris a phone can't show you. Old receipts, a hotel matchbook, a second phone. I found, in the bottom of his gym bag, a burner phone with a cracked screen powered off, the battery long dead. I didn't turn it on. I photographed it exactly where it lay, zipped the bag back the way I'd found it, and called Roy the next morning to ask whether a private investigator could legally access a device like that without running into evidence problems later. He told me kindly that the safest thing I could do was leave it exactly where it was and let discovery compel it later through the attorneys, that anything I did to that phone myself could taint it as evidence and hand David's side an argument about invasion of privacy. So I left it. I zipped the bag. I made dinner. That, more than almost anything else in those 11 weeks, is the moment I understood how much patience real justice actually requires. Not the dramatic kind you see on television, but the slow, procedural kind, built one properly documented fact at a time. Somewhere around week 8, I drove out to the Hampton Inn off I-40 on a weekday afternoon, alone, and asked the young man at the front desk, in the mild, unbothered tone I use with junior auditors who've made an honest mistake, whether the hotel kept incidental folios on file for 6 months or longer, the way most chains do for tax and dispute purposes. He pulled up the folio without hesitation once I gave him the date and the last 4 digits of the card, information I already had memorized by then. The way you memorize a phone number from childhood. Room 214. Checked in at 6:40 p.m. Checked out at 8:55 the next morning. One additional guest fee, unnamed, the way hotels record such things when a room is booked for 1 and occupied by 2. I sat in my car in that parking lot too, the way I'd sat in the storage facility's lot weeks earlier, except this time I didn't need 11 minutes. I needed maybe 90 seconds, because by week 8, the shock had already worn a groove smooth enough that new evidence no longer knocked the wind out of me. It simply confirmed what the groove already knew. By week 9, the spreadsheet had grown to 4 tabs. The first tracked the supplementary card charges against David's stated whereabouts. The second cross-referenced our shared family calendar, the one meant to keep us honest with each other against the location history exports from both our phones, and the gaps between what the calendar said and what the GPS said had their own terrible rhythm, always Tuesdays or Wednesdays, always between 6 and 9 at night, always framed as site visit, supplier meeting, or once memorably inventory, don't wait up. The third tab was the storage unit paper trail, the opening date. The auto-pay history pulled from bank records, a photograph Roy had taken of the unit door, closed, padlocked, entirely unremarkable from the outside, the way most betrayals are. The fourth tab, the one I built last and looked at least, was simply titled Cost, and it totaled, in hard dollars, everything the affair had taken directly out of assets that were, under North Carolina law, at least partly mine. By week 9, I had what any court would call a complete picture. What I didn't have yet was the why of it, not why David had done it. That particular why is depressingly common, and I'd long since stopped needing an explanation for garden variety selfishness, but why Claire, my own sister, had let it go on for 14 months without a single word to me, why the storage unit had been opened 4 years ago, well before, as far as I could tell, anything between them had started in earnest. That question got answered for me unexpectedly by David's mother. Dolores Marsh was 71, sharp as a tack, and had never entirely warmed to me, a polite, decades-long coolness I had always attributed to the ordinary friction of mothers and daughters-in-law. She called me on a Sunday afternoon, her voice unsteady in a way I'd never heard from her, and asked if she could come by. She sat at my kitchen island, the same island where I'd first seen the photograph, and she told me, in pieces, a story I had not been prepared for. 4 years earlier, when David and his father were restructuring Marsh & Co. into an LLC for tax purposes, Dolores had pushed hard, quietly, behind the scenes, through her own attorney, to keep as much of the company's value as possible titled in David's name alone, rather than jointly with me, because she was terrified. After watching 2 of her own sisters lose family businesses in ugly divorces, that if David and I ever split, half the company her husband had built with his hands would go to an outsider, she admitted. Her hands wrapped tight around a coffee mug she never drank from, that she had known about the affair with Claire for over a year. Claire had confided in her, tearfully, guiltily, the way people confide in the person who won't judge them for the wrong reasons, and that instead of telling me, Dolores had encouraged it to continue reasoning in some twisted arithmetic of her own that if the marriage ended in scandal rather than in a clean, cooperative divorce, David would come away with more of the business intact, and I would be too humiliated to fight for my fair share. She had, in other words, been managing my husband's affair like an asset protection strategy. I did not scream at Dolores either. I asked her very calmly whether she had documentation of the LLC restructuring, the transfer dates, who had drafted the operating agreement. She blinked at me, thrown by the question. I think she had braced herself for tears, for accusation, and instead got a woman asking for paperwork. And I realized in that moment that even grief, even guilt, could not fully override what 19 years of forensic accounting had made of me. "You're not going to yell at me," she said. Not quite a question. "Would it change anything if I did?" I asked her. "No," she admitted, and something in her shoulders dropped. The particular relief of a person who has been braced for a blow that never lands. She told me the rest of it slowly, in the halting way people tell the truth when they're not used to it, that she'd sat across from Claire at this same kitchen island, my kitchen island, 11 months earlier, and Claire had cried and said she wanted to end it, that she felt sick with herself every time she looked at me, and that Dolores, instead of encouraging her to stop, had told her, gently, motheringly, that sometimes these things run their course on their own, better than anyone forcing the issue. She said it like advice. She meant it as strategy. "I told myself I was protecting the business," Dolores said, turning the coffee mug in slow half circles on the counter. "I told myself that so many times I almost believed it. But I think if I'm honest with you, Elena, I was also protecting the idea of my son as someone who didn't make mistakes that big. It was easier to manage the money than to manage what it meant about him." I asked her one more question before she left, the only one that wasn't about paperwork. "Did you ever once think about telling me?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Every week," she said. "I told myself next week. For almost a year, I told myself next week." It wasn't an answer that absolved her, and I told her so, plainly, without cruelty. But it was at least an honest one. And honesty had become, over the previous 11 weeks, the only currency in my life I still fully trusted. She did have the paperwork. She'd kept everything. The way women of her generation keep everything. And she gave it to me before she left, unprompted, maybe as an act of penance, maybe because some part of her understood that the ledger of this family was about to be balanced, whether she liked it or not. It complicated things, learning that it didn't excuse David and it didn't excuse Claire. Nothing excuses 14 months of a storage unit under 2 names and a lie told over roasted chicken, but it meant the villain of this story wasn't only the 2 people I'd caught on camera. It meant there was an architecture behind the betrayal, built years before the affair itself, by a woman who had smiled at me across 100 Thanksgiving tables, while quietly working to make sure I'd have nothing to show for 16 years if it ever came to this. Our 16th wedding anniversary fell on a Saturday in October, and Dolores had already arranged months earlier a dinner at her house to celebrate it, family only, 12 people, her good china. I could have canceled quietly. I could have found some private way to end things. Instead, with Patricia's blessing and a folder of documents copied 3 times over, I decided I wanted witnesses. I arrived at 6, in the green dress David had once told me was his favorite, and I brought a leather portfolio I set on the sideboard without comment. David's father said grace. Claire sat across the table from me in a blouse I recognized, with a bright, brittle laugh she kept aiming at nothing in particular. I waited until the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured before I stood up. "I have something to say before dessert," I said, and my voice did not shake. David's face went carefully neutral, the face he uses for difficult clients. "Elena, whatever this is, can we talk like adults? Maybe not in front of. I'd like everyone to stay," I said. "This concerns everyone at this table." I opened the portfolio and set the first page down in the center of the tablecloth. Face up, a printed photograph of the storage unit paperwork, both names circled in red. Unit 118, opened 4 years and 2 months ago, both your names on it. I looked at Claire. "You didn't misplace your dignity in a weekend, Claire. You budgeted for it monthly." "Elena, this isn't what it looks like," Claire started. "It's exactly what it looks like," I said. "I've had 11 weeks to make sure of that." I set down the second page, the bank statement with the hotel charges highlighted, the Hampton Inn 40 minutes from our house on a night David told me he was doing inventory. David's father set down his fork very slowly. "I was trying to make things easier for everyone," David said, and I almost laughed at that, the same soft, useless phrase people like him always reach for. "Easier for who?" I said. "Not for me. I've done the math. 16 years of marriage, 14 months, minimum that I can document. $2,890 in hotels charged to an account with my name still legally attached, whether or not I authorized the card." David's mother did not speak. She looked, for the first time in the 11 years I'd known her, old. "I know about the LLC restructuring too, Dolores," I said, not unkindly, because there was no need for cruelty when the facts did all the necessary work. "I have copies of the transfer documents. My attorney has copies. I'm not angry at you the way I'm angry at them. I understand fear does strange arithmetic, but you should know that trying to protect the business by hiding an affair didn't protect anything. It just meant more people lied to me for longer." David tried again, his voice climbing towards something almost pleading. "Elena, come on, 16 years. Doesn't that count for anything? We can figure this out privately. You don't have to do this here, in front of Dad, in front of the kids. You should have thought about privacy 4 years and 2 months ago when you opened a storage unit with my sister's name on the paperwork," I said. "You had 4 years to decide privacy mattered. You decided it on a Tuesday in October, at my anniversary dinner, in front of a room you knew would take your side by default. I decided it 3 weeks ago in a lawyer's office when I stopped being willing to protect your comfort at the expense of my own dignity." Claire's composure finally broke. "You don't understand what it was like," she said, tears starting, her voice raw in a way that might have moved me a year earlier. "I loved him before you did, Elena. I never said anything, I never acted on it, not for years, and then everything with the fertility stuff happened, and you two got so far apart and he needed someone, and I was just there." "I was in the room for the fertility stuff too, Claire," I said. "I was the one lying on the table. You were in the waiting room holding my hand and telling me it would be okay, and apparently also deciding at some point in that same period that my husband deserved comforting you were uniquely positioned to provide. Don't tell me you were just there. You budgeted $340 a month for just there." Nobody at that table defended David or Claire. His father pushed his chair back and walked out onto the porch without a word. And I understood that as its own kind of verdict, a man who had built things with his hands his whole life, walking away rather than watch what his son had built collapse in front of him. David's 12-year-old niece, who I hadn't even clocked as paying attention, said quietly, "That's really messed up, Uncle David," in the blunt, devastating way only children manage. And something in his face finally cracked, the careful neutral mask sliding for the first time all evening into something that looked almost like the man I'd married. Dolores put her hand over her mouth and didn't take it away for a long time. David reached for my arm as I turned to leave, not aggressively, more like a man grasping for a rope that had already been cut. "Elena, please. I never stopped loving you. Whatever else this looks like. I believe that you never stopped needing me," I said, pulling my arm back, gently, without drama. "Those aren't the same thing, David. It took me 16 years and one photograph to learn the difference. I hope it doesn't take you that long." I didn't stay for dessert. I picked up my portfolio, thanked Dolores for the meal in a voice as even as a spreadsheet, and drove home to a house that, for the first time in 11 weeks, felt entirely mine. I sat in my car in the driveway for a while before going in, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to feel the quiet on purpose, to notice it the way you notice the first cool night after a long summer. Not sad, just changed. The legal resolution took 4 months, most of it uneventful in the way well-documented cases usually are, which is its own kind of mercy after 11 weeks of anything but uneventful. Patricia used the location data, the storage unit paperwork, and the hotel and jewelry charges to argue successfully for dissipation of marital assets, which meant those dollars, recalculated with interest, all $2,890 in hotels, the $612 in jewelry, and 34 months of $340 storage payments, roughly $11,560 in total, came off David's side of the ledger before the rest of the estate was split. David's attorney tried, in the first mediation session, to argue the storage unit had a legitimate business purpose, which was almost funny, since Roy's photographs of the unit's contents, taken with the manager's permission during a routine access log request, showed exactly nothing business-related inside it. A mattress, a mini fridge, a box of candles. Patricia simply set the photographs on the table, the same way I had set my portfolio on Dolores's tablecloth, and let them do the arguing. David's attorney didn't raise the point again. Marsh & Co. was appraised properly this time with an independent forensic valuation I insisted on, and frankly could have performed myself with my eyes closed after 19 years in the field. The valuation came in at $890,000, considerably higher than the number David's original attorney had floated informally, once you accounted for equipment, 3 ongoing contracts, and goodwill built over a decade and a half. David kept the company, since it was his trade and his crews, and I had no interest in running a construction business at 43, but he bought out my equitable share, just under $310,000, once Dolores's earlier LLC maneuvering was unwound, and the marital portion recalculated properly by both sides' accountants over a 3-year promissory note at a fair market interest rate, supervised by both attorneys, payments due the first of every month. No handshake deals this time. No passwords still set to our wedding date. He moved 40 minutes away, closer to the warehouse, into a rental David's father, notably, did not help him furnish. Claire moved to Wilmington that winter, ostensibly for work, and we have not spoken since the dinner. I understand from our mother that she still doesn't fully grasp why the storage unit mattered more to me than the affair itself, which tells you most of what you need to know about Claire, and maybe about the difference between people who understand consequences and people who only understand getting caught. I did not ask for punitive damages, did not try to burn the business down out of spite, did not demand more than what the numbers said I was owed. I didn't need revenge. The truth, laid out plainly enough in dollars and dates and timestamps, did all the damage that needed doing on its own. There's a version of this story where I burn everything down out of spite, where I take David's business apart out of pure vindictiveness, where I never speak to Dolores again and tell Claire exactly what I think of her in language I don't use in front of my mother. I understand the appeal of that version. Some nights in the first few weeks I wanted it badly. Wanted the satisfaction of watching something of his crumble the way something of mine had, but spite is expensive in ways that don't show up on a bank statement. And I have spent 19 years watching what happens to people who let bitterness manage their assets instead of their attorneys. Dolores tried to protect a business by hiding a betrayal, and it cost her son his marriage and very nearly her relationship with everyone at that table. I was not going to make the same mistake in reverse, protecting my own anger at the cost of the clear-headedness that had gotten me this far. 10 months later, I still live in the house with the dogwood tree. I repainted the kitchen a pale sage green that David always vetoed because he said it would make the room feel small. And it doesn't. It makes the room feel like mine. I changed the locks the week after the anniversary dinner, a small practical thing that felt enormous at the time and now feels like nothing at all. Just a key that only fits my hand. I put in a garden along the side fence that gets the best afternoon light. Tomatoes, zinnias, a stubborn row of dahlias I'm still learning to keep alive, and at the back of it, under the dogwood, there's a wooden bench I had made and inscribed with 4 words, chosen only by me. My mother came by in the spring, sat with me on that bench with 2 cups of coffee, and after a while she said, "You seem different, Elena?" I told her I was better, I said. Not because anything dramatic had happened to make me better, but because I had stopped spending my attention on people who spent it carelessly. I started this winter, teaching a free evening class at the community college. Reading Your Own Finances for women going through divorce or widowhood who've never once been shown where the money in their own household actually goes. 12 women in the first class, 18 in the second. I use the storage unit story sometimes, stripped of names as a teaching example. How a supplementary card, a redirected billing address, and a passcode nobody bothers to change are the 3 most common threads in every case I've ever untangled, professionally or otherwise. A woman in the second class, maybe 50, with the particular tiredness of someone who's been managing a crisis alone for a long time, came up to me afterward and said, quietly, "I think my husband has an account I don't know about." I gave her Patricia's number and told her, the way Patricia once told me, to keep collecting quietly, to protect what was hers before she said a single word. I tell them what I've come to believe in my bones, that most betrayal, financial or otherwise, survives on the assumption that no one is paying close enough attention to notice it. I tell them that noticing is not the same as being paranoid. Noticing is just love, applied carefully over time, and once it's gone somewhere it doesn't belong. Noticing is also how you get yourself back out. David and I speak occasionally now. Briefly, mostly logistics, a document that needs a signature, a question about a piece of furniture still sitting in his father's garage. He sounds smaller on the phone than he used to, or maybe I've simply stopped needing him to sound like anything in particular. Dolores sent a card last Christmas, unsigned by David, just her own name, with a short note that said only I was wrong, and I'm sorry, and I have no excuse worth writing down. I don't know yet what I'll do with that. Some debts, I've learned, don't need to be settled on any particular timeline. They just need to be entered honestly into the record and left there. I don't hate David anymore. I want to say that plainly, because I think people expect a story like this to end in fire, and mine didn't. I feel mostly a quiet, settled distance, the way you feel about weather from a storm that's long since passed over. I made coffee this morning, 1 cup, and stood at the sink looking out at that dogwood tree. Bigger every year, and I thought, this is what it looks like. Choosing yourself all the way through, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. So, where are you listening from tonight? I'd love to know in the comments, and I'd love to know if any part of this found you at the right moment. If it did, tell me. And if you've got your own story of quiet, patient reckoning, I want to hear that too. Until next time, stay close, stay steady, and I'll see you in the next one.